when we talk about ancient Greece, the image is usually, well, white marble, right? The dawn of democracy, Socrates debating universal virtue. But what happens when we look at the source material that shines the light, not on the same as philosophers, but on the people standing right there in their shadows?
Yeah.
That's really our mission today in this deep dive, to look past that sanitized version of Athenian glory and uncover the systematic exploitation that really made that high culture possible. I want you to immediately consider this core irony our sources lay out. It's 420 BC, Athens. In one room, you've got these philosophical debates happening, justice, wisdom, all of it. Then just below, literally in the room below, a 15-year-old slave, oiled, naked, shivering on cold marble, waiting to be abused.
It's the factual contradiction is just jarring when you lay it out like that. Athens creates these groundbreaking democratic models, yet roughly half its population existed as property. Just property.
Half.
Yeah.
That's, well.
Yeah, around half. And the men who defined Western civilization, the citizens, they wielded absolute authority. Practices that would be, universally considered criminal, horrific today. Back then in Athens, 2,500 years ago, they were normalized. Sometimes even, celebrated as part of their refined culture.
And the man who perfectly embodies this kind of moral split, this chasm, is the host of that very symposium we mentioned, Critias. Our sources paint him as this Athenian elite, a respected philosopher, a politician.
A public intellectual, basically.
Right. And yet he's simultaneously running one of the city's most notorious brothels as a hetotos, essentially a pimp, managing, and the sources say, a stable of beautiful boys and young men, specifically for the pleasure of the upper class. How do we even begin to reconcile that kind of historical split?
Well, it's the ultimate expression of control, isn't it? The philosophical chat upstairs was a performance among equals, their peers. The exploitation downstairs, that was seen as almost a necessary foundation for their comfort, their lifestyle. The sources strongly suggest Critias didn't see his two roles as contradictory at all. Why? Because the people he abused, they just weren't considered fully human in his moral calculus. They were assets, tools.
Okay, so let's unpack the economy that sustained this, because you said assets. These enslaved youth, they weren't bought for labor, were they?
Not primarily, no. Critias paid 300 drachmas for the boy in that opening scenario we talked about. Now, 300 drachmas, that was more than most families earned in an entire year.
An entire year's income for one person.
Yes. And that cost wasn't for strength or practical skills. It was purely for aesthetics. That financial value tells you everything, really, about the commodity. The sources are very explicit. Beauty was the currency. They were valued for the curve of the jaw, the youthful look, the specific way their eyes caught the light. And because youth fades, this was a depreciating asset, so it required constant calculated maintenance.
Which meant these daily preparation rituals, they sound intense and horrifyingly systematic.
Absolutely. Imported perfumes, expensive oils rubbed into the skin, hair styled very particularly to accentuate what the buyers called supposed feminine qualities. Even their diet was strictly controlled. Not for health, mind you, but to ensure the skin tone and body development that purchasers desired.
It's treating a human being like livestock being prepped for market.
That's a harsh comparison, but functionally, yes.
Yeah.
And the physical preparation was just the start, the baseline. What's even more disturbing, I think, is the depth of the psychological training involved.
What do you mean?
These boys were conditioned,
Yeah.
trained to anticipate the desires of the clients, to understand coded language used by the guests. They had to learn to deliver the exact performance the buyer wanted. Sometimes that meant submissive silence, other times the appearance of apparent resistance.
So they were acting, performing constantly.
Constantly performing. And what did the older, more experienced slaves teach the newcomers about surviving this environment? What was the ultimate mechanism for just enduring the trauma?
What was it?
The absolute core survival skill, the one they drilled into them, was learning to dissociate. The training was basically how to mentally and emotionally disconnect, to almost float above their own bodies, While physically maintaining whatever outward performance satisfied the abusers, they had to act willingly involved, even during the absolute worst moments.
Wow. And the survival rules you hear about sound brutal too. Never show genuine emotion, never form close bonds.
Exactly. Genuine emotion. That could ruin the fantasy the master was paying top drachma for. Or worse, it could provoke a violent reaction. And the masters, they were quick to separate any boys who seemed to be forming close friendships, keep them isolated.
Makes them more controllable.
Precisely. Isolation makes the individual more reliant on the abuser, more dependent, direct resistance. That meant starvation beatings, or being sold off to an even more brutal owner. So yeah, mechanical compliance, dissociation, that was really the only path to any kind of longevity in that system.
Okay, this brings us to maybe the most perplexing part of this whole deep dive for me. How did these incredibly educated elite men, the architects of rational thought, the people we study for philosophy, how did they not just overlook the systemic abuse, but actively develop intellectual defenses for it? How did they manage that level of cognitive dissonance?
Well, the thing is, they probably didn't experience it as dissonance because they engineered their whole morality to exclude these groups. Greek culture, especially Athenian elite culture, established entirely separate moral categories. It's crucial to get this. The high-minded virtues we admire, loyalty, justice, friendship, those applied only between equal, free, male citizens.
Only among themselves.
Right. If you were a slave, a woman, or foreign-born, well, those rules, those virtues, they simply did not apply to you. You were outside that protected circle.
And the intellectual cover, the justification, came from the very top, even from someone like Plato.
It did. Our sources specifically point out that Plato, whose dialogues we still read and respect today, described relationships between older men and teenage boys as, wait for it, the highest form of love.
The highest form of love.
Yes. It was framed as something noble, something that supposedly transcended mere physical urges to reach spiritual truth. It is chilling. And this wasn't just some fringe justification. It was woven into elite education. Philosophical schools actually developed sophisticated arguments for it. Things like, these relationships foster intellectual development in the boy. The beauty of youth inspires contemplation in the man.
Oh, come on.
I know. And even that relationships based on profound inequality taught valuable lessons about power and submission. They were learning these rationalizations right alongside rhetoric, logic, mathematics. It was part of the curriculum, essentially.
That just makes the trauma described in the sources so much more surreal.
Yeah.
You mentioned Critias' guest earlier, Callicrates, this military man. The sources say he's discussing Sappho's poetry or quoting Heraclitus about, I think it was, wisdom coming through the corruption of innocence.
Yes, that's the phrase used.
While he is physically violating the boy. The abuse wasn't hidden away. It was happening right alongside the intellectual discourse, justified and somehow magnified by the very concepts of wisdom they claimed they were pursuing.
Exactly. The violation itself became framed as a kind of lesson, a twisted philosophical rite of passage. That deliberate blurring of wisdom and violation, that's maybe the greatest tragedy of this whole intellectual framework they built.
And this framework, this idea of systemic exploitation and viewing people as property or tools, it wasn't just limited to the enslaved boys in Critias' brothel, was it? Section 3 of our deep dive really forces us to look at Athenian women who were also marginalized in, well, profound ways.
Absolutely. Athenian wives, freeborn citizen women, were fundamentally viewed as perpetual minors. First under the control of their fathers, then handed over to their husbands. They were expected to remain in domestic seclusion, the oikos. And they were explicitly, deliberately excluded from the philosophical and political life that defined Athenian citizenship for men.
And we see that same emphasis on ownership and transaction in the marriage customs, too. Brides were routinely just 12 to 15 years old, often marrying men sometimes twice their age or even older.
Yes, the age gap could be significant.
Our sources confirmed these were basically economic arrangements, weren't they? Transferring property, ensuring legitimate heirs for the family line. The question of the bride's consent seems entirely irrelevant in the sources.
It was irrelevant, completely ignored. In fact, some wedding rituals were explicitly designed to emphasize this transition from one form of male ownership, the fathers, to another, the husbands. The breaking of pottery during the ceremony, for instance, symbolically represented the, quote, destruction of her maidenhood. It signaled her transition to sexual availability, primarily for the purpose of reproduction within the marriage. The whole focus was on establishing the lineage, securing property rights through legitimate children.
So if a woman, an Athenian woman, sought any kind of freedom or intellectual life outside that strict domestic sphere, what happened? She risked becoming a Hetairai.
Right, the Hetairai. These were the high-class courtesans. They were, in a sense, the closest women got to any kind of sexual or intellectual agency in that society. But even that freedom was entirely illusory, really.
How so?
Well, it was a higher tier of servitude, you could argue. Their entire existence, their relative independence, it depended absolutely on their ability to please male clients. These clients held total power over their financial well-being and, ultimately, their fate. Their so-called elevated status just masked a continued dependent existence within a male-dominated economy.
And we even see this kind of institutionalized control, this exploitation, extending into religious practices.
We do. The Dionysiac mysteries, for example, while complex, certainly provided venues where elites could engage in behavior considered scandalous elsewhere, including various sexual acts, cross-dressing, all under the convenient cover of religious ritual.
A sort of sanctioned transgression.
Exactly. And perhaps even more disturbing were practices in places like the cult of Artemis at Ephesus. There, young girls, often from respectable families, served as temple prostitutes for a period before marriage. This was framed as a religious dedication, a service to the goddess.
Framed as religious duty.
But the source material reveals the shocking detail that parents sometimes actually paid for their daughters to have this privilege. They saw this period of essentially temporary prostitution as preparation for their future roles as obedient wives and mothers. The immense psychological cost to the girls themselves, completely ignored in favor of these purported spiritual or social benefits.
Just devastating. So, looking back at this entire landscape, this huge system of control and exploitation, what happened to the individuals caught within it? What was the end result for them?
The cycle of survival is, well, it's harrowing to read about. As the sources illustrate pretty clearly, newer boys arrive, that's the one we started with, and they are systematically broken down. The aftermath for the victims falls along a spectrum, really a spectrum of tragedy. Some, the sources say, just cease responding. Their spirits retreat so deeply inward that they barely seem to exist anymore, shut down completely. Others develop this cold, calculating ruthlessness, as one text puts it. They become predators themselves because they realize, perhaps unconsciously, that being the abuser is the only perceived alternative to remaining the perpetual prey in that environment.
Turning the trauma outwards.
Exactly. And then there are those the sources sometimes refer to chillingly as the lucky ones.
Yeah.
These are the ones who die young enough to escape the deepest, most soul-destroying, lifelong psychological corruption that the system inevitably wrought.
It's hard to reconcile. The achievement of Athens, the rational philosophy, the groundbreaking laws, the art that still awes us, it's undeniably there. It's real. But as we reflect on the thousands, probably tens of thousands, of young lives consumed by this economy of suffering, the sources compel us to ask, what is the true cost of a civilization that seemed to perfectly confuse intellectual sophistication with basic human decency?
That's the core question, isn't it? The philosophical texts endure. The marble columns of the Parthenon still stand, inspiring us centuries later. They are beautiful. But our deep dive today forces us to look past that gleaming veneer, past the Acropolis, and acknowledge the beautiful hell upon which those foundations were built. The history we study, the history we inherit, is so often filtered through the lens of the powerful, the winners, the ones who wrote it down. It makes you wonder, what other shadows in our understanding of history are we still, perhaps unconsciously, choosing not to see?
Something to think about. What shadows are we still ignoring today? Reflect on that until our next deep dive.